Okay, wonderful. Welcome back. I think this has been a perfect sequence of events occurring thus far because we started with Chip Sullivan talking to us about elements of the garden that are essential for sustainability, which in my class I like to call common sense, actually, because the word sustainable is starting to drive me crazy. But also, you know, the idea of, and I know it may seem corny, but I'm a tree hugger from way back. You know, I was in undergrad during the Green Revolution. My undergrad degree's in horticulture. The whole idea of think globally, act locally. You know, live simply so others can simply live. I mean, this is what happened in the 70s in the US with some of us, and you know, and it's still very, very important for us to think about today. So when starting with these design elements that, you know, anyone can use, right? Whether you're in an urban garden, you have a huge amount of property, you know, my friend Catherine's gonna be a farmer, I mean, who knew? Or, you know, things that you can just be thinking about, common sense ideas to save energy, to make your life more enchanting, more wonderful, your daily experience. And then Mauro's wonderful discussion about this bigger picture and all, you know, as teachers and parents and educators, how important it is we get this message out to the young people today about what is actually happening in our environment on a large scale, which is the perfect introduction to our next speaker. Susan McKenna Grant and her husband Michael have a farm called Petraia on the very top of a mountain in Radda in Chianti, where they've created a wonderful 0-kilometer experience, is what I'll call it. It's not a farm, it's not, you know, just this or just that. It's an entire enveloping, remarkable experience. I was just there on a field trip with my class on Saturday. And just to say, Susan will explain their project, but just to tell you a bit about Susan, she left Carleton University in Ottawa, they're both Canadians, and never finished her degree. I guess you're one of those disruptors, right there with Steve Jobs and everyone. I say this because she founded Alias Research, which was a world leader and award winner in the development of computer graphic software products used by creative professionals and the entertainment industry. The software has been used in Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, Lord of the Rings, Forrest Gump, Harry Potter, Stuart Little, to name a few of the films. Susan left Alias to explore a different lifestyle and spent several years with her husband traveling in Europe, studying cooking, pastry, artisan bread making. And in 2001, she and her husband Michael purchased La Petraia, this house in Radda in the heart of Chianti. They've spent the past 15 years restoring and creating this 0-kilometer sustainable mixed working farm. So just a perfect example of what we could see after looking at the statistics from our last talk. Susan has farming roots in Canada, and from her grandparents, and she and Michael have combined their numerous talents to tease out what I would say is the genius loci of Petraia. Genius loci, for those, you know, the spirit of this place. They have, in all its bountiful forms, apiary, vineyards, olive groves, animal husbandry, vegetable, herbs. The products are then taken to the kitchen, where Susan has studied cooking professionally, and then, you know, what's wonderful, since I'm not a very good cook, is then you're able to eat these beautiful things they're growing. And so Susan's written 2 books, Piano, 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 Authentic Food from a Tuscan Farm, and Dinamica, La Petraia Cucina Sistemica e Kilometer Zero. She's my neighbor. I live nearby in Gaioli. I've had wonderful meals there. It's very much an inspiration if I could learn to cook. And she's going to speak to us today on food and the Tuscan Villa Estate. So could we please welcome Susan Grant.
Hi, everybody, and thanks to Nick and Nancy for having me today and for including me, being kind enough to include me in such a distinguished group. When Nancy first invited me to speak today, my inclination was to gratefully decline because unlike the rest of the presenters, I'm not an academic or an authority on the Tuscan villa. I'm a chef, a farmer, and a cookbook author. And with my husband, Michael, who's here today and helped me put this presentation together, the co-owner of Villa La Pietra in Radda in Chianti. But Nancy encouraged me to think about it. And of course, the subject of this conference really did interest me. And then it dawned on me, of course, that historically Petraia, like most other Tuscan farms, had originally been an important part of a larger villa estate. Petraia used to be one of the 40 farms serving Volpaia, the medieval Borgo, just outside of Radda in Chianti. And in fact, the villa estate had only been sustainable because of its podere. And this was a subject I've thought a lot about over my 15 years at La Petraia. So today, I'd like to talk to you about our farm, about its history, about how we found it and the restoration we undertook to restore it to its origins as a sustainable, mixed, organic, working farm that is almost entirely self-sufficient. And finally, I just want to talk a bit about what we do in our kitchens there. So I'll try not to spend too much time on this subject because I think most of you here know more about it than I do. But just to situate things, I want to start by looking a long way back to point out, like Mauro just did, and Chip before him, that the Chianti landscape has been highly curated for a long time now. For example, this is how the Irish writer Mabel Sharman Crawford described what she found here in 1859. Fields where not a weed is to be discerned, farms in which not one crooked or useless fence is visible. Far as the sight can reach, farm after farm for miles, the same richness of produce and the same garden-like degree of cultivation. This is an architectural drawing and floor plan of La Petraia we found in the Florence archives dating from the year 1800. At this point, the house was already at least 700 years old. Like most podere, Petraia was a self-sustaining organism for the contadini who lived and worked there. At one point, at least, in Petraia's more recent history, we know that counted 18 people. Its owners changed hands many times over the centuries, but it was always one of several farms supplying a larger villa like Volpaia. Each podere generally had a focus. Ours, for instance, one of the highest farms in the Chianti Classico, was too high for grapes and olives in those days. But it was known for its orchards, legumes were grown, and pigs, sheep, and even silkworms were kept. But as we all know, the collapse of the Mezzadria system in the last century meant many podere were abandoned. And of course, that collapse pretty much coincided with the start of the Green Revolution and the intensive industrialization of agriculture, when Chianti became a place full of abandoned farms, rudere, and macchia-covered terraces. And the wilderness began to take over. Before we arrived here, the D'Ambrosio family were the last contadini to live and work at La Petraia. They abandoned her on September 19th, 1958, and I was born in Canada 10 days later. A modern industrialized America had lured this family to Boston, where they're still based today. So for Petraia, that broke a continuous cycle of farming that we're able to trace back at least 800 years. And just as an aside, the two youngest boys in this photo made a pilgrimage back to Petraia a couple of years ago with their children and their grandchildren. And it was a very emotional experience for them to see the rebirth of Petraia and for us to meet them. The exit of many of the contadini from the Tuscan countryside was followed by the foreign invasion, which many credit with the revitalization we've seen in Chianti today. But the needs of foreigners like us are very different from those of the villa estate and of the contadini who inhabited the podere serving them. Instead of traditional farming expertise, communities in Chianti now need other things. And today, the children and grandchildren of contadini are contractors, electricians, architects, hospitality workers, agronomists, and enologists. The contadino verges on the brink of extinction, and instead we have yaps. For those of you who don't know what a yap is, it's an imprenditore agricolo professionale. That's what I am. A professional farmer. I had to study and take an exam to get that qualification, and this is a suitably looking official document from the province of Siena. I have to prove it. And I'll tell you an interesting story about how I got that a little bit later. Farmhouses like ours today, ironically, are often called villas by their foreign owners. Many have been transformed into holiday homes or form part of one of the many large winemaking estates in the region. And while it is true some of them are still owned by the original families that have held them for centuries, many are part of large international conglomerates that make wine on an industrial scale. And agriculture in Chianti is now focused almost entirely on the intensive production of grapes. Wine is carefully blended year to year to make it easy to sell in markets the world over and please the tastes of an international clientele who want their bottle of Chianti, like their can of soda, to always taste exactly the same. Many podere today are also agriturismi, but these are rarely more than restored farmhouses on larger monoculture estates. And if you visit one, you might expect to get a glass of wine or a bottle of olive oil produced there. And that is quite likely to be all that's produced there. In the last century, the self-sufficient mixed family farm has virtually disappeared in Chianti, like it has in the rest of the Western world. Today, it's only a distant memory to people my age and older. We have friends in Radda who were born on podere and whose parents were contadini. Their parents, like my own parents, represented the last generation for whom a small mixed family farm could be considered a viable enterprise. And this is a huge change in a single generation. And I think it's one we haven't realized the full impact of yet. Take the exquisite Cintosinese pig, for instance. Legend has it, this breed was technically extinct before a single farmer decided to bring them back. Take the Pesa River, for instance, one of Tuscany's most important rivers. A source of that river is here on our property. The picture that's coming up next was taken in Sambuca near Tavernelle in Val di Pesa, where we see the Pesa again, a little bit bigger, and that's a Roman bridge that's spanning it. I have friends in Radda who remember fishing in the Pesa when they were kids. There used to be delicious crayfish to catch in it. Today, the Pesa around Radda, at least, is pretty much dead from pesticide use. Chianti also experienced a huge brain drain with the near extinction of the contadini. They were the keepers of traditional farming knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate. And in one generation, much of this has disappeared. This is knowledge we need now, and we'll need it much more in the future, and I know from my own firsthand experience just how costly it is to recover. Combine that with the effects of globalization, the ever-increasing regulatory environment we're all living under, and the Italian bureaucracy, and you have a situation where it is increasingly difficult, some would say even impossible, for a small mixed family farm to exist at all. And I have firsthand experience of this too. But there is also some good news. Fortunately and curiously, Chianti has managed somehow to remain one of the most beautiful places in the world. And one might argue, despite all of the changes of the last century, the landscape appears on the surface at least, much as it was. And this is thanks to a combination of local wisdom and a bureaucracy that makes things change very difficult. Buildings can't be torn down or expanded. They can only be meticulously restored. And as we heard from Mauro, it's almost impossible to cut a tree down anywhere. And that's all good, I guess. I've visited many of the world's most important wine regions, and Chianti, by a long shot, wins the prize for natural beauty. So that brings us to La Petraia, where, as you can see on this photo taken from our front lawn, we can see all the way to Siena, 32 kilometers as the crow flies. And that gorgeous Chianti landscape appears not to have changed in centuries. Since I'm talking to you at a place called Villa Sassetti, at Villa La Pietra, I'm sure you probably know that La Petraia means place of stone in Italian, or pile of rocks, depending on how romantic you want to get, and that it is a pretty common place name in Tuscany. Our Petraia is located on top of the Chianti Mountains and is one of the most remote farms in the comune of Radda in Chianti. A place called Piazza di Siena is the property's high point, but also for as far as the eye can see. Hundreds of years before the Romans set foot in Tuscany, there was an Etruscan archaeological or a settlement here. And it's the top left of this photo, the sort of raised plateau, that's Piazza di Siena. And then just under it, you can see our house and our vineyards surrounding it. Our location might seem a bit remote today, but once this was a strategic point of passage between the Chianti Senese to the south and on the left of this Google Earth photo, and the upper Valdarno Valley, which was a gateway to Florence, Romagna, and Emilia, and on the right here. The white snaking line to the top right is the Cassia Adrianea, and it runs along the top of our mountain and marks the boundary of our property and also that of the province of Siena and Arezzo. It's a Roman road still used today by wild boar, fallow deer, and their hunters. So how did we get here? Well, I grew up in a farming family in Canada. My mother and grandmother were excellent cooks, and my father was a passionate hunter and forager, and I learned a lot about the wilderness from him. A vegetable garden was always part of our lives, and we lived as much as we could with food we produced ourselves, not because we had to, but just because we knew it was better than anything we could buy. And later this became a way of life that I missed. And Michael, also a Canadian, is from Toronto, and after university spent much of his life living in the country and even grew some of his food there. When we met in the mid-90s, we were both disillusioned with our respective jobs and looking for a change. And we wanted to find an agricultural property that would provide us with enough income so that we could afford to live in a beautiful place. We didn't care where in the world we found it, but it had to be in a region with architectural integrity, a sense of history and of community, and ideally we wanted a property protected by wilderness and somewhere where we could grow most of our food. So how did we find Petraia? Even by today's standards, its location, 10 kilometers from the small village of Radda, on top of the Chianti Mountains and 3 kilometers up a dirt road, is a bit remote. But I think the better question is, how did La Petraia find us? Because she did. Nicolas Joly, the well-known French biodynamic winemaker, once told my husband Michael that people are drawn to places for a reason. The Etruscans had inhabited Petraia once, and we suspect, like most ancient peoples, they settled in places possessing powerful energy. When we first visited, we certainly felt something special. We were immediately drawn to the place. Since then, of course, we've discovered we're just the most recent in a long line of people Petraia has seduced. So I think it's entirely possible that La Petraia is the one who found us. It had been on the market for 3 years in 2000 when an eccentric Australian real estate agent driving a very old, beat-up blue station wagon showed it to us. The road up wasn't much more than a mule track in those days, and when he got us up, halfway up it, he stopped the car and said, "This is as far as anyone usually lets me take them. They say they don't care what's at the end of this road." And we thought that was pretty funny, an Australian telling this to a Canadian, right? Because we both come from big empty countries with lots of dirt roads and not very many people. And we both knew a road was an easy thing to fix. But a place like this, a location like this, was almost impossible to find in the world. And that was the day it all started for us, if you can believe that, from looking at this photo. But the property did check all of our boxes. Our plan was to restore Petraia to its origins as a self-sustaining, working, organic farm, and to open an agriturismo that would include 4 guest rooms, a restaurant, and a cooking school. So why an agriturismo? As I mentioned before, in Chianti, there are already tons of them. You can pretty much pick up a stone anywhere, throw it, and you're going to hit one. In fact, the very first agriturismo in Italy was at Podere Terreno, our neighbors in Radda in Chianti, and just over the hill in this picture, just a stone's throw from La Petraia. But I had been very seduced by the romantic concept of the agriturismo as it had been originally conceived in Italy, something I'm not sure it's ever become. A working farm that could earn a little extra income by welcoming tourists. A place where people could experience authentic farm life and taste a variety of foods produced there. And for someone like me who loved to cook, what could be better than to open a restaurant on an organic farm and be my own supplier? And so we began the restoration. The property had not been worked for over 40 years, and in the first year or two, we spent most of our time waiting for permissions and trying to decide whether, if we got them, we should go forward with the plan. We didn't speak any Italian in those days and knew absolutely nothing about how things worked in Italy, and financially, the whole thing was going to be a huge stretch for us. In those early days, we were forced to wait. But as a result, we had time to listen and observe. And looking back, I'm convinced that had we been allowed to start the restoration project immediately after we bought Petraia, we would have approached it completely differently and not been nearly as sensitive to the property. For instance, we had a lot of time just to walk the property, all 165 acres, and it was incredible what was growing there spontaneously in fields that hadn't been farmed for 40 years. Mainly, we found a predominance of wild legumes, brassicas, and a variety of fungi. Wild fennel and mint, malva, oxalis, and chicory. I suspected many of these plants were the descendants of crops that had once been cultivated here, And so in our first orto, I planted lots of different varieties of legumes and brassicas and chicory. Nightshades and thistles grew helter-skelter at the base of crumbling stone walls, suggesting artichokes and tomatoes and eggplant might thrive in these warmer spots, and sure enough, they did. Over 15 acres of an ancient chestnut orchard and large expanses of oak proposed a natural habitat for the local breed of pig, the Cintocinese, recently recovered from the brink of extinction in our province of Siena. The remains of an old frutetto stood on the dilapidated terraces closest to the house, where we found wild apples, cherries, pears, quince, figs, almonds, hazelnuts, and persimmons, framed by a magnificent alleyway of 300-year-old mulberry trees where silkworms once had been kept. We discovered there were families of wild boar living in those trees' hollowed-out trunks, and they wreaked havoc on anything we tried to plant in our first vegetable garden. We were also approached by a young agronomist from the Department of Agriculture in Siena who was looking for a farm to lend her some land for the development of an heirloom experimental fruit orchard. Elisa had been roaming Tuscany, visiting abandoned farms and villas, and identifying fruit trees that were on the road to extinction. She was able to do this with the help of paintings she found hanging in the museums of Siena, like this one on the cover of the book she ended up writing about her project. No one would give her any land because, of course, in Chianti, it's too valuable for grape growing. So she was thrilled when we said yes to her project. And we got this amazing heirloom orchard out of the deal. She planted it the way old orchards had always been before the days of refrigeration, with several varieties of each fruit ripening at different times. The pear shown on the cover of her book is an early one that comes in June. And then we have other varieties that come later in July and August and September. In total, we have 150 fruit trees. And while she was working on that project, she also discovered a pear tree unique to Petraia, now called the Petraia pear, and a peach almond tree she'd heard about, and that it had once been local to Radda, but she assumed she was probably never going to find it. A few years after we arrived, we also commissioned a historian to research Petraia's past, and deep in the Florence archives, he found meticulous records kept by generations of previous owners. We found detailed records like this one, hundreds of years old, recording seeds bought and planted, harvest yields, and much more. Sure enough, legumes and brassicas had been grown at La Petraia, pigs and sheep had been kept, and Petraia was known for her orchards. But this research just confirmed everything that by then Petraia had already told us. This is a lease dated March 15th, 1372. It's a Mezzadria registered contract between Jacopo, son of a privileged Chianti landlord, and Bello, the son of a farmer from a small village just the other side of the Chianti mountains. The contract was notarized by Lorenzo of Vopaia and is the first record we have of anyone farming at La Petraia. 650 years ago, Cheney was able to secure a donkey and a pair of oxen in return for this lease. So thanks to all of this, we have a pretty good idea of what went on at Petraia in those early days and what it looked like too. And this has helped us immensely in our approach to the restoration. This is an old drawing of Petraia from the year 1800 that we also found. And this is the Google Earth photo that we looked at just a minute ago. You can see the footprint of Petraia today is almost identical to what it was over 200 years ago. We have almost exactly the same amount of fields, cultivated today as were then, and the same amount of land is forest. Historically, it was pasture land and orchards, and today we have vineyards, olive trees, and orchards. Historically, the property never would have been fenced. But if you look at the small-scale map of Chianti, you'll see on our property there's something called the Val di Ciliegie, the cherry tree valley. And that's a stand of cherry trees that were planted along the boundaries of our fields. And what they did was provided a barrier for the wildlife. When they came out of the forest, they would get stopped by the cherries and eat the cherries instead of going into the fields to eat our crops. So that's just an interesting way that the contadini knew how to keep the wildlife away. The layout of the farm is today the same as it was back then, with the animal housing, fruit, and orto closest to the house, providing easy access. And then next come the fields, and then the forests, which surround the property, and were then, and still are today, an important part of it. They were, and still are, managed carefully to provide us with fuel, game, wild berries, lots of other fruit, mushrooms, and lots more. And the view is also, I think, pretty much the same. And today, like yesterday, we're producing the same kinds of things. Vegetables, pigs, sheep, mulberries, and lots more. Under dense macchia or brush, we discovered ancient stone walls covered with lichen, one of the slowest growing plants in the world. They framed a series of elegant terraces stepping down the mountainside. The lichen suggested they'd been built a very long time ago. In the Chianti of today, as we saw in Mauro's talk with the photographs around Albola, which they're our neighbors, masterpieces like this are usually fodder for bulldozers and are frequently raised to produce more real estate for the precious grapevine. We were loath to let this happen, but restoring dry stone walls like this was going to cost us a small fortune that we didn't have. So it was a happy day when we met this man, Dr. Remigio Bordini, someone who shared our sympathies and understood immediately the potential we had sensed in La Petraia. Up until then, our search for an agronomist had resulted in a series of handsome 40-ish men who would arrive in late model Land Rovers from which they would hurriedly escape, clutching a baggie in one hand and a trowel in the other one. They'd walk as few feet as possible to hit some actual dirt to scoop up into the baggie, and then they'd be off again. And a couple of weeks later, we'd get a bill in the mail for several hundred euros and a soil analysis saying, guess what? We should plant Sangiovese grapes. So we're not the Antinori family, and we haven't been doing this for 600 years. We knew we could never compete with them. Whatever we did with Petraia, we felt it had to be three things. It had to be different, it had to be sustainable, and it had to be excellent. So Remigio arrived at Petraia one day like our Australian real estate agent friend in a beat-up old blue station wagon. An elegant man in his early 60s, the first thing he asked was if we would take him for a walk. And we noticed right away how he took his time examining not just the soil, but everything that grew in it. Here was a man who knew how to listen to a property, just as we'd been doing. And then he sat down to listen to us, and he left saying he would give the project some thought. He wanted to come back, spend the night, and talk some more before he decided if he would take us on. And he did come back several times and would often spend the night and got to know us in Petraia pretty well before he said yes. So we knew from all of this, here was a very wise man and someone we could trust with our vision and with Petraia's future. So Bordini's idea was to plant the vines, but not to move the soil at all. We would just put a hole in the ground with a small tractor like this one and pop the little plants in. No excavators. Petraia's topsoil, after all, had been undisturbed for 40 years. It had sat out the Green Revolution, and we all wanted a chance to be able to bottle that. But he would only agree to work with us if we would agree to restore those terraces. The Tuscans, he told us, had been known all over antiquity as master stone builders, and the terraces and the stonework we had at Petraia was a work of art. And now we could afford their restoration because his no excavation plan had saved us that small fortune we didn't have. But like us, Remigio was a foreigner in Chianti. He was from Romagna, and we were Canadians, and for those first few years, everyone thought we were crazy. The word on the street was those Canadians up at Petraia don't have a clue what they're doing. You can't just stick little vines in the ground like that and expect them to grow. Those plants will die. But that was okay, because by now we had also discovered something else. It was normal for La Petraia residents, for Petraia residents to be considered a little bit duro. To this day, in and around Radda, there is a local saying for someone who may be a little bit slow. He or she is referred to as having been born up at La Petraia. One of Radda's most distant farms. I suppose there must have been some inbreeding going on here. So the fact that we didn't appear to be that bright either, well, nothing had really changed. And in fact, in those early years, Michael and I did have more than a few days when we wondered ourselves just how smart we'd been to embark on this whole adventure. With the long restoration project finally finished, we slowly began to realize our dream. Our orchards were restored, our walls rebuilt, and vineyards were planted. We had a huge vegetable garden that supplied us with all of our vegetables year-round. We were raising Cintosinese pigs, and they were living on the acorns and chestnuts from our forest. We were also raising ducks, geese, chickens, quail, squab, rabbits. Sheep provided me with milk for yogurt and fresh cheese, as well as lambs every spring, and they helped us keep the grass cut in the vineyards. The property also provided us with boar, venison, hare, and pheasant, as well as a huge variety of wild food. We were farming organically and had also implemented biodynamic practices. We also hired an amazing team of people to work with us, but let me tell you, this was not easy. Like I mentioned earlier, there had been a brain drain in Chianti. Professional agronomists and enologists were abundant. Anyone who knew anything about actually growing a vegetable or raising an animal were older, retired people who didn't want to work anymore. There were lots of young university graduates, but most of them had no real experience and were trained in modern intensive agriculture. So we made a lot of costly mistakes. I think we could have easily avoided if we had been able to find a real contadino. But gradually we've put this great team together, and while we have made a lot of mistakes, of course, with each one we've learned something valuable. And there have also been many success stories. Sadly today, though, we no longer have animals. Michael and I had both been vegetarians before we bought La Petraia, And I had always vowed our animals must die on the property. And if a day came when that couldn't happen, we would not have them anymore. What was the point of raising animals like this in a semi-wild state and giving them an amazing life, and then on their last day, and most important day, putting them through the trauma of being loaded into a truck and shipped to a slaughterhouse? Thanks to new laws, that day finally came. So today our kitchen is largely vegetarian, although we do still get lots of wild game from the hunters who use the property, and we do still keep bees. And I've had to become a yap. As I mentioned earlier, that's a professional farmer. Another new law declared that only yaps could qualify for particular permissions and subsidies that we needed. So I spent months studying for this important exam and making sure I'd be able to answer any question about our farm. I arrived early in the morning at the scheduled time to the classroom in Siena to take the test in front of a panel of experts. And I was quite nervous because we had a lot at stake if I failed. The room was packed with other would-be yaps. And the first thing that happened was that exams were passed out according to what kind of farm we had. There was an olive exam for the olive growers, a grape one for the grape growers. Those with animals had their own exam, as did those growing grain. But at Petraia, we were doing all of those things, and there was no exam for a mixed farm like ours. So I was instructed just to pick one of the other tests. It didn't matter which one. And of course, all of the questions related to something we weren't doing, intensive monoculture, and I didn't know any of those answers. And I'm sure I probably would have failed that written test if it wasn't for one of the examiners who took pity on me and helped me out. But fortunately, there was also an oral examination where each of us were asked about our own individual farms. They left me till the very end, probably convinced I would fail that part of the test too, and they'd be done with me. But I surprised them, of course, because I could answer those questions. And I was also able to tell them some stories about our unique approach to farming Petraia, and they were fascinated by those. They ended up spending more time with me than they had with any of the others. For instance, I told them our zucchini story about the first year we began using the biodynamic planting calendar. As the zucchini started to ripen that summer, I noticed that some of them plants were producing beautiful big flowers, but the fruit was very sparse and it was distorted. And then other plants were producing beautiful, beautiful zucchini, but almost no flowers. And I was perplexed at first because we'd only planted one kind of zucchini. But then I remembered that some of the seeds we'd sown on flower days and others on fruit days. And because we use, of course, both fruit and the flowers in our kitchen, and we wanted to see what the difference would be. And boy, was there ever a difference. And so then they asked me, well, what do you serve in your restaurant that you produce on your farm? And I told them, well, the better question is, what don't you produce on your farm that you serve in your restaurant? Because our menus are based entirely on the production of our farm, and I only buy a few things like flour, coffee, chocolate, and salt. Next, they wanted to know, so what would I do then on a day, say, if I only got 6 of those zucchini flowers and had 24 guests to feed? How did I manage that? And I explained, well, this is an issue we have all the time, and it forces us to get creative. And that's really the whole point for us. Maybe only the women will get those flowers. Maybe we'll give the men the zucchini. That's how our kitchen works. And then their last question, which was a good one, was, what kind of food do you cook? Because you're a Canadian, do you cook Canadian food, or whatever that is. Or do you cook Italian food, or do you cook Tuscan food or Chianti food? None of those, I told them. I cook La Petraia food. So we finally got our license to open our restaurant, guest rooms, and cooking school, and our days were busy. Streams of appreciative guests were falling under Petraia's spell. You're living the dream, many of them would tell us, but Michael, who had spent half his life making films, was quick to caution. It's an easier movie to watch than it is to make. La Petraia had provided us with many challenges, and we'd had more than our fair share of days when it was not a dream. But every time we were about to surrender to failure, and never a moment before, Petraia always mysteriously would provide exactly the right solution for us. Oh, and by the way, to the locals, we're not so slow anymore either. In fact, I'm proud to say Petraia has become a little bit of a Radese showpiece. Things really changed about 5 years ago when we got a call from the mayor. Radda is twinned with a village in the Cognac region of France, and a busload of dignitaries from there were headed to Radda for a weekend summit. And the mayor had some impressing to do, and only enough time in the short stay to show them one local farm, and he'd chosen ours. So I just want to talk for a minute now about what we're doing in our kitchen. My goal with Petraia's kitchen was twofold. I wanted the meals we served our guests to be based entirely on the production of the organic estate, and I wanted them to be different. Like I said before, you can throw a stone and hit an Agriturisimo in Chianti, and we're not Tuscan. Just like we don't want to compete with the Antinoris and assume we can make a great Chianti Classico, I don't want to compete with a Tuscan cook either, making ribollita and papa al pomodoro, because I don't have an understanding of those dishes deep in my DNA like they do. But I did have a deep understanding of Petraia, and I wanted to create a style that was unique to her. I wanted a modern cuisine that looked forward, but that took its inspiration from the past and the incredible landscape around me that had been so carefully curated all these centuries. Because I think one of the things we can do here is that we can look a long way back, and that's something that we don't do so well in North America. And that ability to look back was something I wanted to use because I think there's wisdom to be gained from that. It's one of the reasons I think Tuscany is so well preserved today, and I wanted to use that to inform our kitchen. I wanted to create a cuisine that was dynamic, reflecting what was going on at the property right then in that moment. Something that tomorrow would be entirely different. And this pushes me to get creative in ways I would never dream of if I was allowed to shop at the Metro. This is a photo of the cover of my last cookbook. It's one of our signature dishes we call Sarah and Salva, and it's different every day, but the idea is that it always includes something we cultivate and something we forage. In this version, it features the fresh cheese we made from our sheep's milk, spring vegetables, wild calendula, oxalis, and portulaca. So my world is pretty amazing. This is just a short list with over 100 ingredients, both wild and cultivated, just a fraction of what Petraia provides me to work with. Our recipes and techniques are constantly evolving, and our kitchen uses modern technology like steam, pressure, induction, and sous vide to help us showcase what Petraia provides. Probably I'm most interested in color because a new one takes over our landscape almost weekly. In spring, it's pink and white with the early blossoms of apple, almond, elder, chestnut, and acacia. Yellow comes next with wild brassicas and broom and calendula. This is a multicolored lasagna noodle we make, and we use lovage leaves for the green color, our saffron for the yellow, and red beet for the red. After yellow comes blue and violet, and the delicate flowers of wild legumes, rosemary, sage, and lavender. And then we turn pink and red in June with dog rose and poppy. And then high summer brings burnt sienna, the color of terracotta. In September, the rain turns everything green again before the leaves turn orange, rust, and purple in late fall. So we try to reflect that palette in the kitchen, and we incorporate lots of wild herbs and flowers into all of our dishes. We also use vegetables as food coloring, like you saw in the pasta photo and here in this one. This is a cabbage leaf we candied and then dried out in the oven to make a purple cabbage candy. We discovered the syrup it had been cooked in will gradually change color from violet to fuchsia with the addition of a few drops of our homemade wine vinegar, and this is what is giving us the interesting effect on this plate. And every day, everything is freshly harvested, and our tasting menus are brand new based on that day's harvest. So I'm going to end my talk now with a short slideshow that Michael's just going to plug in. It's about 4 minutes long, and I've got a few more words I'll say while that's playing. It represents a full day at La Petraia. So today La Petraia still sits defiantly on top of the Chianti mountains and is once again, the productive mixed farm she has been longer than anyone can remember. We've given her the gift of a major revitalization and introduced her to the 21st century. I hope you can see how much she's given us in return. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I must also tell you that recently Michael and I made the very difficult decision to put the property on the market. It's just time for us. Petraia has been passed around for centuries now, and we've dedicated now more than a quarter of our lives to her restoration. We have a couple of other adventures we'd like to give a go. But until that happens, we're going to enjoy every minute we have left here because we're both pretty sure we're never going to find such a beautiful place to live and work again. We don't have any plans for our future yet, and we won't start thinking about it either until Petraia decides who she's going to seduce next. And so just what about the future then of Petraia and of the Podere in general? Well, I have to be an optimist. A few years ago, we commissioned an environmental study, and the environmentalist was hugely excited to discover an organism long thought to be extinct near the source of the Pesa on our property. And just last summer on my way to Radda, near the bridge over the Pesa, I had to stop my car for several minutes while a crab crossed the provincial road. It was about this big, this crab. And I didn't mind. In fact, I was fascinated to watch it because I'd never seen a crab like that here before. And later, retelling that story around Radda, I found they were once common about a generation ago. And others had noticed them that summer too, starting to reappear. Then, of course, there's the Cintosanese pig, which was brought back from the brink of extinction. Perhaps its gene pool isn't quite as pure either, but it's the same, for the most part, the same pig that's always lived in the forests around Siena. And then the contadini. Well, like the Cinta, the genes aren't so quite so pure either, but we have a few friends in Radda who think you might be looking at one. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a huge honor, and buon appetito.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask if anyone had any questions for Susan. I'm just so enthralled with the fact that you keep referring to Petraia as her. Every time you say it, I just think, oh my gosh. Does anyone have any questions? Everyone's hungry, thinking about after looking at those last images. Yes, Kath?
Yeah, well, we'd heard that this law was going to be changing for years, and then it finally changed. And then we read the Agriturisimo rules, and it appeared that as an agriturismo, you actually could slaughter your animals on the property. And so we didn't know what to do. And so we went to the Department of Agriculture in Siena and asked them. And we pointed out where it said in the Agriturismo rules that you can, and in the EU rules where you can't. And they didn't know what to do. They said, no one's ever come and asked us this before. Give us some time and we'll look into it. And then they came back to us and they said, well, we don't really know what to tell you. So we just decided that, we couldn't really live with that because we're serving food to the public and the health department could come in any day and close us down. And I just didn't really want to take those kinds of risks, especially being a foreigner here. You're just, a little bit more cautious, I think, so.